think moderator Andres, and you can all take a seat up there. Andrés, creo que se siente. Sí, que todos se sienten ahí. Y Andrés, son 4 micrófonos y son 5, entonces tendrás que pasar.
Ok. ¿Micrófono? ¿Prendes aquí? Listo.
Can I please ask you all to sit down? We'll start. Should I stand on the stage or should I stand here? What's better? Up. I'm going to come up here. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch and have had an opportunity to discuss even further some of those topics we were talking about this morning. I'd like to introduce the second panel of the day, which is on anti-corruption, transnational crime and governance. And we'll have a discussion around the regional challenges on these issues. Just to quickly introduce the panel before they start, starting from the far end, we have Edward Perez. He's an attorney at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in Costa Rica, and he was a Chevening alumnus in 2014. We then have Maria Laura Roteta, who's the head of the Prosecutor's Office for Economic Crime and Money Laundering in Buenos Aires, and she was a Chevening Scholar in 2009. We then have just here, we have Juan Carlos Restrepo, who's Presidential Advisor for Security to the President of the Republic of Colombia here in Bogota, and Jorge Restrepo, who's the Director of CEDAC, which is the Conflict Analysis Resource Center, again here in Bogota, and he was a Chevening Scholar in 2009. Moderating for us today, we have Andres Ucros, who was a Chevening Scholar in 2014, and he is currently Peace Construction Director at the Bogota Chamber of Commerce. Over to you, Andres.
Good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure for me to moderate this panel with such distinguished guests. The way the panel is going to work is the following. We're going to have interventions by each of the panelists, interventions of around 10 to 15 minutes. Then I'm going to open some questions, reacting on the interventions. We will have a dialogue between the panelists and the moderator, and then we will have around 20 minutes for questions, discussion with the public. So thank you very much. I'm very glad that we have very important and knowledgeable panelists. As you see in the bios, this is all people that are hands-on on the work of transnational crime and corruption. As they call it, practitioners. So I hope we really learn from this panel this afternoon. I'm going to give the word to Laura to start. So thank you very much, and you have around 10 to 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andres. Good afternoon to everybody. It's an honor for me to be here in this panel. I want to thank you, Colombia, for hosting us. Chevening, of course, for organizing this. And also in my case, I want to thank Costanza Gali, who is always organizing good spaces in Argentina to make healthy debates. I'm a criminal prosecutor, so my point of view will be from a criminal prosecutor. I want to focus on one of the questions, which is how can we tackle transnational organized crime in Latin America, which is not an easy answer, and we have to work a lot. First of all, it's important to mention that corruption and organized crime have a wide range corrosive effects on society and especially hurts the poor and vulnerable sectors of the society because public funds that should benefit them are diverted to individual interests. Such crimes undermines democracy, the rule of law, good governance, economic development, and distort equal commercial opportunities and transparency in financial system. Organized crime is a problem not only of the international community, it is a problem of the society as a whole, and the responsibility to fight against these crimes are not only of the public sectors, they are also a problem of the civil society and the private sector. We should all be together to combat this kind of crimes. To put an example, corruption is like tango. In Argentina, we dance tango. Corruption is like tango. We need two dancers. We need one that make the illegal payment and another one that receive the illegal payment. Without the two dancers, we don't have tango. Without the two parts, we don't have corruption. So it's a problem of all of us to fight against transnational organized crime. And corruption is, in most of the cases, a transnational organized crime. In this panel, I will focus on possible actions that prosecutors can carry on to tackle transnational organized crime. The question is, which are the most important challenges that justice administration from Latin American countries face when dealing with these cases? In other words, how can prosecutors plan a solid strategic case theory to fight against these crimes? Argentina, for example, has signed all the international treaties and conventions to fight against these kind of crimes, although we need yet enforcement. Enforcement is the key point that we are dealing in Latin America and in the world in general. I think that to move to the challenge to have enforcement is to move to a new paradigm of investigations in this kind of crimes. In other words, the challenge is a cultural one in Latin America. Of course, also resources and good legal frameworks are needed as well. The first things we have to highlight is that transnational organized crime is organized, is transnational, and criminals want to have an economic benefit. Palermo Conventions has this definition. It's more broader, but I'm making the future things. So when we are dealing with organized crime, we have to take in mind that it is also a complex phenomenon, and the investigation of this is also very, very complex. For an effective investigation, I will focus on three fields. First of all, I think we should focus on money laundering and asset recovery. Second, I think that we should focus on cooperation, international and national cooperation. And later, in my last part of this presentation, I will focus on a very particular problem that we have in Argentina, is that we have a criminal procedure that is not working well to fight against transnational crime. In order to be effective in fighting against organized crime, the international community has some decades ago put focus on the economic benefits of the crime. To be effective to fight against these crimes, we should focus on the economic benefits of this crime. This type of criminality moves a lot of money all over the world. So the commitment, the motivation of these crimes are to have a profit, an economic profit. For example, Giovanni Falcone, that was an anti-mafia judge of Italy, he focused on this economic field. He focused on the network of money laundering of the mafias, and then he was murdered. Some people say because he put the focus on this kind of point in the investigation. So this is really, really important to go against the economic profits of the crimes. This is easy. The strategy is that to make this business risky and not profitable, and to block the possibility to introduce dirty money in the international financial system. With this strategy, we try to promote a negative incentive for the illegal business from a rational economic standpoint. For those who doesn't know, not everybody here is a lawyer nor a criminal lawyer. Money laundering basically is much more difficult, but basically are the actions that are made with the purpose of concealing and disguising the illicit origin of the property in order to make it appear as legal in the financial system. So the first thing we have to focus, prosecutors have to focus, is that in this kind of crimes, we will be in front, for sure, of a case of money laundering. So when we are dealing with organized transnational crime, we will have, for sure, a money laundering case. The link is quite easy. Money laundering is the favorite method that organized criminal groups use to enjoy the economic benefits and have impunity. So the first thing for a good strategy, prosecution strategy, is to start in the first moment an investigation of money laundering within and in a parallel way of the investigation of the predicative offense, which can be human trafficking, drug trafficking, corruption, or whatever, tax evasion. There are a lot of predicate offense. Financial investigation for assets recovery, which is other focus that prosecutors must have in dealing with this criminality, and money laundering are closely related. To confiscate the proceeds of the crime, we need first to find them. And when we are trying to find these proceedings, we sometimes see that the road of the money has been alterated, and in those cases, we will have for sure a money laundering case. We have a lot of practical advantages in investigating together money laundering and the other offense. I won't go in all of them because I will get bored, and we have a very interesting dessert, and we are trying not to get sleep with that dessert, so I won't go in all the practical advantages, but yes, I want to mention some of them. First of all, this will undermine the economic power of organized crime. Second, we will be able to go to the final beneficial ownerships, who are always the most important people in the organization, which is a big challenge for justice administration to go in the top of the pyramid in the organizations. And third, we can have a recovery of the assets. Assets recovery is a key point in this kind of investigation. We should adapt provisional measures in order to confiscate the proceedings of the crimes. It is important to know, this is just an example, that in Argentina we don't have confiscation without a criminal conviction, only we have it in some cases specific, but nowadays we are debating a law to confiscate without a criminal conviction. This is a huge discussion in my country. And the challenges for the assets recovery is to create, in my country at least, a proper institution that can transparently administrate these assets, to have appropriate rules to return the stolen assets to the jurisdiction. This is very important, how to share the assets between the different jurisdictions that are investigating these transnational crimes. And in the last point is also to think about give social benefits to the assets. This is very important because if we go give a social benefit to the asset society, we'll see that the judiciary is working, and then they will have also a benefit in these investigations. The second field for a good strategy of the case is cooperation. International cooperation is stated in all the conventions. This is a key point, and this is because we are talking about cross-border crimes, which affects more than one jurisdiction. The use of technology makes that this transnational characteristic goes faster, since information, economic benefits, and the author can move very fast between the jurisdictions. The major challenge for international cooperation is to make it broader, faster, and more effective. The traditional way to cooperate is with MLAs, mutual legal assistance. We are very slow, and they have a lot of formal requirements. This makes that when we need some information or some evidence abroad, we will have to wait a lot of time. So this is a major challenge. Organized crime does not use MLA. They don't use MLA. We have to use MLA. And organized crime that doesn't have a sovereign principle, and we do have. So in this point, we are in disadvantage. We will need cooperation to request information abroad, seek evidence, and adopt provisional measures. One way to make this cooperation more faster is to use informal channels of cooperation. Informal channels of cooperation they don't replace the formal cooperation, but they can help to make it faster and more specific. One of these ways is exchanges of spontaneous information between prosecutors. Use some here trust is the key point. If you trust the other prosecutors, the other judges, you will exchange information. All that has experience in this area says the same. This is a matter of trust. Also, there are different networks that we use. I won't bore you explaining these networks, but they are official networks where we can safely exchange information between officials that are appointed in that networks. This also, sometimes what happens is that when we are searching for the information to give to the other country, we find that in our country there was also committed crime, or the crimes has an effect in our country, so we can start investigations. Another very, very important tool is the joint international teams. These joint international teams are all the conventions talk about them. We don't have many experience in Latin America. Europe used them a lot. They have a lot of experience in joint international teams. They have the European Union, which facilitates the use of this tool. Basically, it's a legal agreement between two or more states to cooperate and coordinate a joint investigation in the territory of all the states. Which are the advantages of the joint investigation teams? First of all, coordination. It is a tool for a more effective prosecutor. Prosecutors from different countries work in the same team, and this generates a fluid coordination of the actions taken during the investigation. Second is fast. The exchange of information is direct. You don't need MLAs to exchange the information. In the third point is that it generates efficiency. You can assist during the procedural measures in other jurisdictions, something that is very difficult to do if you don't have a joint international team. Also, it generates fraternity. There is a common goal in the investigations. With the MLA, the state that is requests is not its own investigation, so it will only give the information without being involved in the case. Then it generates trust, it avoids problems with the ne bis in idem principle, and also it is easier to avoid pressures and impunity because there are more than one country's prosecutors intervening in the case. The disadvantage is the different legal systems, the resource. In the case of Europe, Eurojust is the one that pays the cost of the joint investigation teams, and the different cultures and the language. But as well as we need a good international cooperation, we need also a good local cooperation. We also need to generate fraternity between the different public agencies of the states to fight against this crime. Some obstacles to a fluid exchange of information between agencies are data protection. In Argentina and almost more of the countries, we have data protection law, so prosecutors can't have some kind of information. We have to ask for a request to the judge. This is an obstacle for a good investigation. Also, another obstacle is not to have a final beneficial ownerships register. This is a key point, to have this kind of registers. And another point that is very important is criminal corporate liability or corporate liability. For example, Brazil, with the Odebrecht case, they have administrative corporate liability, and it has worked and has worked well, as long as I know. In Argentina, we don't have in the general part of the criminal code criminal corporate liability. We have some laws that allows criminal corporate liability, and we have recently passed, the Congress recently passed a law that for corporate criminal liability for corruption cases and for foreign bribery. And this is a very important law because it also talks about compliance program, and it's the first time in Argentina that a law obliges to the companies to have a compliance program, and that compliance program can have effects in the sanction or in the to reduce the sanction of the companies. And the last point is that we need a good legal framework to fight against organized crime. To have effective and good investigation, judicially needs enough resource and a proper legal framework. Therefore, the criminal procedural system is of key importance. Latin America is mostly based on civil tradition law. However, most of the Latin American countries, they have accusatory systems. In Argentina, we have the challenge in Latin America is to change the culture and make these adversarial systems work properly. In Argentina, we have two challenges because we don't have at the federal level an adversary system. We have still an inquisitorial system where the one that investigates is the judge. So prosecutors, we don't carry on the investigations. We have some exception, but basically it's the judge the one that carry on the investigation. This procedure is not effective to fight against organized crime because it is difficult for prosecutors to have a case strategy, which is what I'm talking here in this panel. Also, we have the legality principle where we cannot, there is not a determination where to prosecute or not, so we have to prosecute everything, and this goes against good investigation in the important cases. Settlements can be done by the prosecutors, although they are not the ones that carry on the investigation, and this is also a problem. And also we have a written part of the process which generates a lot of problems because it generates delays, it makes the defendant can make a lot of appeals, and this is a major problem, the time that takes the investigations of crimes and corruption crimes. So, to resume, something that is very important is that Argentina has an accusatory criminal code. It was passed by the Congress, but it was suspended, and it is supposed that it will get into force nowadays. So we are going to have a big change in our legal system. And of course, we need this cultural change, which is not only from Argentina. All Latin America should change the culture for a more accusatory and adversarial one. We have this civil law tradition and inquisitorial systems, and this is a real challenge. I think that to finish, I think that we are in a major problem. Transnational organized crime is a problem of the international community, but also is a problem of the society, and we need to make a cultural change, and we prosecutors have to change the way of investigating these crimes, because we are, if we carry on traditional investigations, that investigations are not effective for this kind of crimes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Laura, for a wonderful intervention. Very clear, stating 3 clear proposals regarding how can the state have a creative and effective investigation. Assets, profits, money laundering, the ways that the cooperation should work between the states and within national institutions, and the correct framework, the legal framework. So those are the really interesting points. And I have to say that if we should be like in Colombia, we will not say tango, but we will say vallenato. And you always need 2, exactly. And that happens immediately the same as here in Colombia. Now I will give the chance for Edward to speak about this interesting topic.
Thank you very much. Okay, so the idea that I have for this small presentation is actually to convince you first that there is a relationship between corruption, transnational crime, good governance, and human rights. Further, I would like to present a different perspective on how to study the issue of corruption and transnational crime from the human rights perspective. I will focus on corruption mainly, given that the previous presentation focused a lot on transnational crime. And given that, I wanted to start this presentation like making reference to some stories that I know of regarding how corruption has influenced human rights. Mexico, for example, has recently had a case of a very particular situation in which a governor gave an instruction. I'm sure this story has more precisions, but a governor issued an order that certain chemotherapies that were going to be given within a determined hospital, state hospital, they were not giving them chemotherapies. They were actually giving them, I think it was water. Exactly. And that is clearly, I mean, when one starts studying the issue turns out to be actually an issue of corruption. But that affected directly the health and lives of a lot of people. Similar situation in Guatemala, not so much time ago. There was a situation in which, well, people, the adoption rules in Guatemala were very, very, very lax, that you could say that. And basically you could go to a notary and give someone in adoption. But the problem was that in this act, the notary said that everything was okay in adoption, when what was actually happening what was actually happening is that there was like human trafficking, kid trafficking network that was underneath that. There was another case of clear corruption that affected the rights of the children and most importantly, the prohibition of slavery. Talking about prohibition of slavery, well, there's a big situation of Venezuelan women who are being trafficked to Mexico, to Colombia, to many states, and are being offered even forced prostitution. And although there are elements there of it's clearly an issue of organized crime, the transboundary effects, the migration part of this issue has also some relevance regarding corruption. And don't even get me with the issue of the Venezuelan passports, that you actually have to buy them, which is by far a clear act of corruption that affects the right of everyone to circulate freely and naturally wherever you want. I mean, we all have a right to have a passport, right? The stories, which are just some of the many stories that are very, very part of our culture in Latin America, are the proof of how corruption is actually an indication of the denial of human rights, and with it, the denial of good governance, and democratic institutions. Good governance and democratic institutions are clearly, they're quite a broader term than just limiting it to fighting corruption and protecting human rights. But by far, these are one of the most important points. The respect of the human rights protection requires states to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights that every single individual has, for the simple reason of them being individuals: life, health, free speech, all of them. Corruption is precisely going against that. Corruption is precisely the denial of those, insofar the state is acting, or the state or individuals within the state are acting towards gaining some sort of benefit in detriment of the respect, protection, and fulfillment of the rights that they are obliged to give. This is particularly relevant when it comes to economic, social, and cultural rights, which by nature imply the obligation of states to give something, to give a service to the individuals that are within their jurisdiction. Then, this, just to conclude, that human rights, the human rights it's like a coin. I mean, it's like a coin. One side you have human rights, the other side of the coin says fighting against corruption, which would mean that by logics, denying human rights, one of the ways of denying human rights is corruption in itself. Then there is something that I would also like to stress, is that corruption actually makes states even more responsible of the facts that they're not complying with their human rights obligations. We commonly understand that if a state kills someone, or if a state doesn't provide health care to someone, then it could be argued that there is a human rights violation. When corruption is behind it, the state is actually even more responsible, because there is an act of public servants that argues that, that tolerates or actually gives acquiescence, or even says yes, it agrees on it, gives consent on the act of corruption, which goes in detriment of the people who are benefited of the public service, or who are simply affected by the act of corruption directly. Hence, it is hard to argue that the states do not, the state as a state, as the international state, this is not going to be responsible for those acts. It's actually going to be even more responsible for it. Given that fighting corruption is cornerstone to upholding good governance, and the role and the call for action that I'm going to make on this very small presentation that I'm making is that corruption is an issue that clearly must be addressed by the state, but that must also be addressed by the civil society, and must clearly be also addressed by the private sector, by distinguishing civil society like NGOs or us as individuals, private sector as business and other types of enterprises. And given the context of this whole meeting, the Chevening scholars, as part of the civil society, are part of that. Just as a point that should be stressed out, and that I invite us to discuss afterwards. Precisely, Chevening scholars, I would believe that under the statement that, well, a government invested in us because we're going to be leaders, I'm going to try to promote that being part of that leadership implies certain types of obligations that we all have regarding corruption, which I will make reference afterwards. But the minimum point is that from wherever we are, it is relevant that we firstly ask for the cessation of all types of corruption. We do not endorse it. We actually condemn acts of corruption in wherever the point are, in order to foster the strengthening of the democratic institutions, the rule of law, and good governance in itself. Then I would simply like to stress, to present with this, I would like to present here some, let's say, some calls for action of opportunities that we have as Chevening scholars, as part of this network that we're trying to form towards accomplishing the upholding of human rights, good governance, and the eradication of corruption as a problem. Firstly, once more, stressing that endorsement of corruption should be by all means prohibited, and the promotion of human rights and democratic institutions, I already stated that. But there are actual measures that we as a network could take towards strengthening democratic institutions and accountability. The first one is also makes a reference to both human rights and the fight against corruption, which is the promotion of transparency. Transparency has a three-dimensional content. The first one would be the content from the public servant in itself, from the government in itself, in which the ideal would be that every single individual should promote transparency from within the government, from within the role, the competences that they have within a determined government. As part of as part of that dimension, you have, for example, several good politics from different states, which include the prohibition to criminalize whistleblowers. Whistleblowers meaning those people who give information that has been upheld within the government institutions and is simply afterwards published. Many states are already upholding the prohibition to criminalize these kinds of activities, and that is obvious because it's a way to promote transparency and with it reduce spaces where corruption could occur. A second one would be from the private sector, from enterprises, the private sector, as I meant before, businesses and other enterprises. And the space there is mostly related to contracts with governments. Contracts with governments tend to have many clauses regarding confidentiality and all that, but those clauses must be interpreted always under the prohibition of corruption. Insofar that then the private enterprise has a duty in itself to foster transparency and to not involve itself in acts of corruption. It's actually quite common sense, but when we mean fostering transparency, then several measures within the private enterprise could be made. For example, publishing in their websites the possible information that is relevant to the community, despite the fact that the state is not fostering, promoting that information in itself. Those are some of the measures that the private sector could implement. And then there is the part of the civil society and other parts, civil society and us and individuals, and maybe the Chevening network in itself, which is making the claim requiring transparency. It's a role, it's kind of an activist role, but it's a role that is relevant insofar only through an organized activities can transparency claims be made. And given that corruption and lack of transparency are actually some quite widespread problems within the regions, then a regional Chevening network could be a nice approach towards eradicating, towards making common claims towards the eradication of corruption and towards the promotion of transparency from a regional perspective. A third point that I would actually make reference to is making international alliances towards fighting corruption. It's similar to the argument that Laura presented before, and that is definitely applicable in the same terms to the fight of corruption from a human rights perspective. Common goals, I mean, when referring to a global problem or a regional problem, it definitely requires a regional approach and definitely regional proposals towards addressing the issue. And without that international cooperation between, and I'm not meaning international cooperation between states, I'm actually meaning international cooperation between institutions, between private sector, between basically everyone that I mentioned before. Without that, it is going to be actually very hard to identify issues of corruption, particularly in those cases in which corruption is going to have an effect on other states, which occurs very much. Or, as was mentioned before, there was, for example, the Odebrecht case, which has some perspectives from transnational crime, but it also has a very important concept within corruption. And it affected, as it has been recently revealed, Brazil, Peru, Venezuela, Colombia in some measure, and clearly Brazil, Argentina, and so on. Without the international cooperation that existed between between civil society and other government institutions, it would have been hard for the Odebrecht case to actually have been brought up to light, because it was the cooperation from one state with the others that led to the prosecutions that in which the case still goes on. And then I just wanted to close up my intervention reminding one of the proposals that was made before, actually something that was unanimous in the workshop that we had before, regarding the possibility of having this network of chevening towards achieving certain goals. And within that network, there are many, creating that network is going to be instrumental to achieve many of the goals, but in the particular case, it's going to be instrumental to make claims. If it were a point that was desired, it could be instrumental to make claims regarding transparency and the fight against corruption. And more, and with that, to foster good governance between the region. Such networks can help, and they don't don't necessarily have to be all together in one simple spot like this, like we are going to right now create the solution to corruption. No, the simple fact that we create a regional network towards discussing these kinds of issues is going to be an asset that may allow the involvement of Chevening in the fight against corruption, an irrelevant involvement of Chevening in the fight against corruption. And with that idea, I simply would like to conclude that human rights require an approach that involves, the protection of human rights require an approach that involves every single party, the states, the civil society, and businesses and other kinds of entities, the private sector. Corruption is just one of the issues that we can address with it. But without the cooperation between these institutions, or at least the participation, the active participation of these institutions, it is going to be really hard to actually try to address any kind of problem, regional problem, from an integral perspective. Corruption is a global problem. It's a regional problem, definitely. And because of that, it requires a regional approach to address solutions, with considerations clearly to the local particularities of each case, but definitely a regional approach, as in the protection of human rights in itself. That's why I would like to conclude inviting all of us to incorporate not only corruption, but the whole point of good governance and democratic institutions in the debates as what the Chevening community could do towards that. A human rights approach to the fight against corruption requires that, as we're part of the civil society that has a duty to promote democracy and fight against corruption with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edward. There you guys have a clear call to action, and I'm sure it will be a very nice input for our discussions on the workshop. It's also, I just wanted to point out that if you see the current indicators on corruption, uh, the, the countries that have the highest rate of corruption are also the countries that have the lowest indicators in protection of human rights. So I just wanted to point out that relationship, and maybe we can talk about it later. Now we have the Colombian side of the panel. We have Juan Carlos Restrepo and Jorge Restrepo. So I will give the word for Juan Carlos. He's actually the advisor for the Colombian government on security, and I'm sure he has a lot to talk about and give us some input on the topic. So, on to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm proud and very happy to be here. I would like you to notice that of all the panelists, I'm the only one who's not a Chevening alumna, and also the only one who was not given a microphone. So there's a bit of discrimination here. I would like to address this panel and this audience from the standpoint of someone who has been in the private and in the public sector. I'm a lawyer by formation. I worked in a law firm for 10 years, and then in a multinational company for 15 years. And then I was called by President Juan Manuel Santos to once again pay a military service to my country, which I accepted gladly. And my first encounter with the public service had everything to do with corruption. I was appointed, never having had a public office before, except having been a soldier in the Colombian Army. I was appointed as the director of the National Anti-Drugs Agency, which was the most corrupt agency of the entire system, because of obvious reasons that I will elaborate in a while. I had never been in government. I knew nothing about the basic rules of how to manage an agency within a government, much less the Anti-Drugs Agency of Colombia. And when I used to live in Venezuela, and President Santos calls me, and he says, I want you to take charge of the Colombian Anti-Drugs Agency. It was called Dirección Nacional de Estupefacientes. And I said, hell no. Why? What did I do to you? I mean, and he says, why not? And I said, that's where the worst two problems of Colombia meet, which are drug trafficking and corruption. And you would be very small in front of that combined problem. And I wouldn't look well, and I wouldn't make you look well, because that combination of problems, corruption and drug trafficking, is overwhelming. I said, it's not possible. We hang up, and he calls me a month later, and he says, if I tell you that you have all my support to do whatever you feel that needs to be done, will you please take it? And he left me without arguments. No, and I said, but I live in Venezuela, and I know what happens in the drugs agency. I mean, imagine how evident it was. And I think that you would, I mean, to solve that, you would need to put many people in jail and liquidate the agency, because it's absolutely corrupt. There's no way of recovering it. And he says, you have all my support. Can you please take it? So I came over, I came back to Colombia, I took office, and 14 days after taking office, I raided, or asked my own agency to be raided by the police. A week after taking office, I step into the president, he says, "What have you found?" And I said, "I think I found the mother camp of corruption. What do you think we should do?" And I said, "I think we should raid the agency." And he says, "Okay, go talk to the prosecutor and talk to the head of the police. Only the four of us know about that." So 14 days after taking office, I'm sitting there in my office, very nervous, and the police storms in. Was everyone in a room, and we'll start calling each one of you by name, and you tell us which one your computer is, and we will copy your computer. And that started one of the major corruption scandals in Colombia, and one that came out very well, because we were able to put my two predecessors and like 35 other people in jail. We were able to liquidate the agency. We were able to distribute the functions of the agency into other agencies. It had two functions. One was to manage the anti-drugs policy, and the second one was to manage all these assets that had been seized from the mafia, which was the source of the corruption, because it was a huge gold pot, more than 74,000 assets confiscated from the mafia. And people from the mafia didn't used to buy cheap things. Very ugly, yes, but not cheap. And that created a huge corruption statu quo, because there is a phrase in our Latino way of speaking that we say that a thief that robs from another thief has 100 years of pardon. So people felt that because those 74,000 assets had been seized from drug traffickers, they had the right to get a portion of that. And it was the system who became corrupted. Also, third parties and people who acted on behalf of the drug dealers who had lost part of their fortunes, etc., they also acted, but the system was corrupted. And I understood that mafia and mafia activities evolve. We used to be a very important player when we talk about mafia. We had all the drug pins, the drug cartels, and all that. But in the days of Pablo Escobar used to kill the judges. If there was a judge who had the bravery to issue a judgment against Pablo Escobar, he was sentenced. Now you never hear that a judge is killed. It's because the judge is bought. Why do I have to kill you if I can buy you? I can buy your conscience, I can buy your activity. I'm the owner of whatever you do. And that's the second generation of mafia. You see mafia in the public powers, you see mafia in the control agencies, you see mafia in many parts of both the public and the private sector, because it has the ability to corrupt. So that's the second generation of that far west type of mafia with a gun in their fingers. It's evolution. It's the capacity to adapt to different circumstances, and we still have mafia today. I'm ashamed to say that in Latin America, our political systems favor corruption. It's a clientelistic, or I don't know what the term is, system. How can you explain that someone who wants to become a senator, someone who wants to become a governor, has to spend more than $5, $7, $10 million in their campaign when their salary is just $6,000 a month. There's no way in which that works out. And that clientelistic system, our political system, is accepted. We live with that. And we find cases where they're put in evidence, they're caught, and there's a scandal, but for every scandal, there are 10,000 people laughing because it wasn't their turn. Because they caught the right one, but it was not their time. So, having said that, I think that it is incumbent upon civil society to have the ownership, to claim the rightful right, excuse the redundancy, to have a clean and transparent society. I know it sounds utopical, but society is the only agent capable of cleaning a system that is naturally disformed by corruption. And if I should leave you with just one piece of advice, at least from my experience, is that you lead by example. It's not criticizing, it's acting. I think that private policies come afterwards. They can come simultaneously. But it is society, it's the values of society, it's the reaction of society that will become an antidote for corruption that crumbles the institutions. Today, and it happens not only in Colombia, our institutions no one feels represented in our institutions. Our Congress, I feel ashamed for my Congress. Our justice is in the middle of a corruption scandal. The executive power has a very low credibility. The judiciary, the legislative, the executive, there's a lack of capacity to represent people. And that's why people are looking for ways to represent themselves. Social networks, the fact that we have in Colombia, we had nearly 50 pre-presidential candidates, and only 3 of them ran on behalf of political parties. 47 used to be individual people who claimed to have the capacity to run this country. So there's a lack of representation, and the lack of representation is a consequence of the delegitimization of institutions. And that delegitimization of institutions is partly due to corruption. And that corruption is partly due to this clientelistic model where people go to public, some people, it's unfair to generalize, but there's a system where some people need to spend more than they will earn to be elected. So it's a system where we need a cultural change. I happen to know I have a friend who's a coach, and he He's a coach for the mayor of Palermo in Sicily. And he helps the mayor of Palermo in Sicily transform that mafioso culture. Someone in Palermo would say to his father, he used to tell me, Dad, I want to get my driver's license. I'll call the inspector and I'll get you a driver's license. You don't have to make the driving test. You don't have to take it because I'm a friend of the guy who issues the driver's license. And he says, we're working with that. And he's currently working with the mayor of Medellin, a city who has suffered a huge transformation from an anarchy provided by mafia and corruption to a city full of civic values, of ownership. The people in Medellin, the big 5 businessmen of Medellin, they used to pass on the leadership of the agency that runs the public services, like in a military service. Now it's your turn the next 3 years to run the public services of Medellin, and then it would be your turn. It was a way of protecting their city and providing good management and knowledge to the management of public assets, public goods. So I think that it is fair to say that as a society, as people who have had the privilege to study, to evolve professionally, to be intelligent, to have privileged positions in our different societies, we have the duty to lead by example. I think that's the most important thing. Then the attorney generals and the prosecutors will follow, and then the international court and cooperation will follow. Many things will follow, but it's society that needs to run this business, and it's incumbent upon us to reject corruption. Corruption which is public and private. Corruption which can be found in small acts or in huge businesses. Corruption that we can find in the doorstep of our homes, or in the Congress of the Republic. So that's my story. I hope somehow it is inspiring. I didn't have to do this. I left the comfort of being an expatriate in a multinational company to be the head of the worst agency. And the president was very explicit. He said to me at that point, he says, I don't have anything worse to offer. No? And at least he was honest, and he kept his word, and he promised that he would give me all the support that I needed to change that agency, and he kept his word. Afterwards, I helped him. We had a similar situation with our intelligence agency. We had liquidated the intelligence agency, and he asked me to form the new agency, to help him form the new agency. We tried to hire Jorge. He wouldn't accept. But we created a new agency full of controls, full of transparency, even though it's the intelligence agency, which is not always transparent. And so here we are. Today, apart from being the National Security Advisor, I was just 3 months ago in November, the president calls me again. He says, we have a very corrupt agency, the agency that runs the prisons in Colombia. Can you please take charge of that? And today I'm double hatting, doing the 2 positions, but it's the reason is one. I think it's leading by example. Walk the talk. and be there and be transparent and open the windows. Sounds kind of rude, but when you turn on the lights, whatever bad things are happening there, I was going to say another word, disappear. You need to open the windows. You need to be visible. And that comes from both government and private sector. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I wanted to maybe just pick up on the issue of the evolution of crime, understanding crime not just as a legal phenomenon, but also as a sociological one or a cultural one. And in fact, we are very lucky because we have Jorge Restrepo here. He's expert and doctor on economic analysis of crime. So he will share with us, I guess, some views on that issue. So Jorge, please.
Thank you very much, Andres. Well, this is too loud, sorry. Thank you very much, Andres, and thank you very much for being here, waiting until the end. You know, they actually took much more time than what we agreed. I'm trying to be brief then to let you rest. I mean, I don't have anything so inspiring to say as Juan Carlos, not personal experience because I say no, but I have thought about what you have mentioned before me, and I reckon that we need to learn about experiences. I reckon there has been a lot that has been done, but my message will be that, and I hope to convince you as well as my predecessors, that we need to do things differently. We need to change the way that we approach the issues of transnational crime and including corruption. Not because we are doing the things the wrong way, because of course, as you already mentioned, the three of you, we are doing things right. But in my view, there is not enough. We still need to do more. Transnational crime is quite a complex phenomenon. And me being an academic, I reckon we need to insist that these type of complex issues need to require complex policies and complex approaches that need to be changing as the issues itself are changing as well. That complexity requires complex approaches. And then I have like 3 or 4 issues that I reckon I would like to touch on. First, we need to consider that security, and in a way I'm putting it on the positive side, crime is a threat to security, to property rights, to the livelihood of people, to the lives of people. Security, it's a regional and public good. And we need to start building that as a public good. This is not, or fighting against crime, transnational crime, is not an issue that will benefit those that are affected by crime. It will benefit the entirety of the society. It will benefit the region. It will benefit, even on a global scale, improvements on security will benefit the entire globe, especially because we are talking here on a region that is actually causing harm on a global scale, causing or experiencing a situation of insecurity that is creating harm on a global scale. Now, thinking about tackling organized crime or crime in general in the region require recognizing that nature of security as a public good. But that requires cooperation. In my view, we do not have enough cooperation. We need to build on the initiatives of regional and global cooperation to tackle crime. You mentioned several of them. but we need to do more. There are good experiences, for example, in terms of trafficking in arms. We have the Inter-American Convention Against Trafficking in Firearms, the CIFTA, for its name in Spanish. But that CIFTA needs to become much more effective, much more active. We do have, for example, academic networks, and you mentioned that in terms of understanding organized crime. But we need to do more on that. There are several networks on that, but they are very poor, despite receiving funding, for example, from the Corporación Andina de Fomento. We really need to, or the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, or the professional societies of economists. I reckon we need to do much more. We need to have large conferences to know the work of other researchers and academics in order to know what is going to work and what is working well. The OAS, for example, has some programs in terms of tackling regionally crime in the Americas. But we do need to make that, or those conferences and networks to bring them to politics. I reckon we still do need to do much more in terms of cooperation. I reckon we are not doing enough. Here in Colombia, for example, we used to talk about shared responsibility. Recently, I heard several political leaders talking again about shared responsibility. I reckon the arrival of this hideous government in the United States, I'm not a diplomat, that's maybe I didn't join the government, but since we have that government in the United States, I reckon we need to organize a much more decisive and propositive action, cooperative action, in order to have more progress in terms of fighting against crime in the Americas, in particular transnational organized crime. Let me mention the second point that I want to do, which is that we need to be based on evidence. The story that Juan Carlos just mentioned minutes ago, it's a story that, to my view, has not been properly documented, properly studied. Was so effective as you put it? I mean, I really don't know. And if it was not effective, what was the reason why it was not effective? I don't mean to criticize it, but where that strategy stopped working? In the judiciary, in the prison system, did the National Police of Colombia had the actual elements to make it work? Did the prosecutor services manage to bring all those cases to be as effective? Did the new agency for selling these assets, what is the name, the Sociedad de Activos Especiales, is working as well as it should? Do we need to make legal reforms? Are we making those legal reforms from an effective base point of view? And you see, I'm making a lot of questions, because I want to mention that here in Colombia we have this awful meme, this idea that reproduces generation by generation, which is that we do know enough. We say here in Colombia that we don't need more diagnostics. Colombia está sobrediagnosticada. That's the way that it's put here in Colombia. But actually, I do believe that we still are lacking a lot of diagnostics, especially in this issue of organized crime. How affected are women, children, communities by crime in the region? Is it true that we are putting all the resources where we need to put them, where they can yield the more profitability, especially, let me put it that way, social result in terms of managing to affect the organizations that are imposing on the society such large costs as we are seeing. Because I don't know. Let me think. For example, in terms of a draft, do anti-crime policies need to be guided by effectiveness or not? Are we being really effective in what we are doing? What are the causes of crime? Another meme here in Colombia that we have tried to discuss and to challenge from social sciences is that crime comes out of poverty, is caused by poverty, is caused by inequality. Is that true? And for which crimes? Is that true for transnational organized crime? It's an issue of human rights. It's truly an issue of human rights in terms of the denial of human rights. I reckon that those are provocative questions that we really need to bring, especially to the planning process. And when I talk about the planning process, I'm not only referring to the planning of programs and actions for governments, but bringing these, for example, to police services. Planning and effective-based policing, results-based policing, as they talk about that in the United States, is something that we have not done sufficiently enough in Latin America. I reckon we need to start learning about those ways of planning police actions and where to put the resources of the judicial police, the prosecution services, and the proximity police in order to be much more effective. Of course, we need much more money for research. You know, I'm an academic, and you know, I have to beg and to just chip in to say that we still have no programs of research in any agency in Latin America, any academic agency in Latin America, call it the CONACYT or Colciencias, or any one of those agencies, in order to try to understand what is working and what is not, to have proper diagnostics that are able to inform policies to make them more effective. And let me be a little bit more undiplomatic. Are we sure that we are not being influenced? You know, we have these coming months, a lot of political process, electoral processes taking place in Latin America. How far is Russia impacting on those processes? And I'm just making this question because we do not have the academics in place in order to be able to even ask the questions about that. We do not have the linkages between the intelligence community, the prosecution services, the judicial police, the national police systems here in Latin America in order to understand which are the evolving threats that are going to affect and that is transnational crime, I reckon, you know, maybe. We do know that in Mexico, maybe in Argentina, they are impacting the politics. What I meant to say is that transnational crime is affecting politics big time in Latin America. There are, I was just reading here, they told me that Congress in Peru is going to hear another impeachment process for the president. You know, that's the impact of transnational crime, that transnational crime is having in Latin America. And that is another point in the agenda of studies on crime that we need to do. What is the real impact of transnational crime in Latin America? Because we do believe that it's large and it's actually touching even the state. It's funny enough, there were a couple of successful guerrilla groups that managed to bring about revolutions in Latin America and bring down governments and the entirety of the system. But you can count with you need a couple of hands, the number of governments have brought down by transnational crime in Latin America. Guatemala, Honduras, maybe Peru, I don't know, in Brazil, Salvador, you know, you really need several stories to talk about that. Then The third point is that there is a political dimension, and this is very brief. There is a political dimension on fighting against transnational crime. This is a political issue. And of course, I do know that previously I said that we need to take an evidence-based approach. But of course, there are things in which we don't need to have that evidence in order to act. And as Juan Carlos mentioned before, we need to make this a prominent political issue in the electoral debate, in planning and programs, in the media attention that transnational crime is receiving. And we're very short on that. We need media, specialized media, and the media, the traditional media, to take a specialized look at these issues of transnational crime. There is another point in the agenda. Of course, and I promise this to you, there is a significant, a critical element, and this is my fourth point, that we need to address or to include in order to address or to tackle transnational crime, which is a gender view of this. Here in Bogota, recently, the local administration decided to hire 60% of the new traffic police members. They needed to be women, with the idea that women are less corrupt. This is a service, a police service, which is provided by the National Police Service. That is, everyone knows here that it's petty corruption, that type of, give me something and I will let you go. And they decided to put 60% of the new cohort of police officers on the traffic service, that they needed to be women. I'm asking a question. Do that works? Are they really less corrupt? Is this functional? You mentioned the case of Palermo. I do remember that major of Palermo, that I forgot his name, he mentioned that what was more effective in order to fight violence against organized crime was bringing women, mothers, the grannies, the teachers, women, into the policies against organized crime violence for the Sicilian mafia. Is that really working? Can we replicate that? Can we deal, for example, with gangs in Salvador, Medellin, Rio de Janeiro, going to the women in order to try to bring them to the fore as an effective force for social change? What are the social innovations in which we can, in a way, and excuse me for using this word, that we can utilize women in order to bring that potential for social change that they can provide? Not only see women and to take this gender view of women as the victims of violence and the victims of crime, but more thinking about what is the real potential of working with women and from a gender perspective in order to tackle crime. And I think the first point, the fifth point, and I want to finish with something which is really boring, is that we really need to create capacity. In my view, and this I see that here in Colombia, we have these grand designs for policy. We just finished a war, a civil war, an internal conflict. Talking here in Colombia about civil war is still kind of politically incorrect. I do believe that it was a civil war, and we have this grand design that was negotiated in La Habana between the FARC guerrilla group and the Colombian government for years. And it's very well designed. But in the sense, the critical point, the most important point of that agreement, in my view, is that it created a lot of institutions in order to bring social change. The solution in order to finish that internal conflict was to create an institution for property rights protection, an institution for this and that. But the critical idea, the key idea there, one of the key ideas was to create institutions in order to resolve those conflicts. We are not doing that in terms of tackling transnational crime. We really need to think what are the institutions which are effective in order to tackle transnational crime. You mentioned several of them, judicial cooperation. But just take this example, what our prosecutor, general prosecutor, is doing in terms of this Odebrecht scandal. He actually has to take a plane and to think about what would be the willingness of the Ecuadorian Fiscalia or the Brazilian Fiscalia to cooperate with him in terms of judicial cooperation. In my view, we still do not have the proper inter-American institutions functional inter-American institutions in order to cooperate transnationally. For example, we do have the CIFTA agreement that provides a draft weapons law or arms control law for the Americans. Do we have sufficient laws or effective laws in order to fight against organized crime in the Americas? As far as I know, there is one law in Argentina, I think, against organized crime, and one in Mexico. Of course, one in Spain. But in the rest of countries of Latin America, we do not have an anti-organized crime statute that is wide enough and effective enough in order to fight against organized crime. Same against corruption. Of course, there are international conventions that provide a draft draft laws in order to be able to fight against corruption. How many countries of Latin America are or had put in place those laws? Are cooperation mechanisms? Are they working? How well articulated with the prosecution services are? Are conferences in order to be able to build on that? And I reckon that institutional capacity building is still something that we do on a piecemeal case, on a one-to-one case, country-to-country case, and in general there is no South-South cooperation. I hate that term, but inter-country cooperation from the South is not working, while transnational criminal organizations, they are indeed cooperating with extraordinary success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Now we have some time for a few questions from the audience. We've taken a bit of more time here in the panels, but I think it was a justified measure. So it will be great if somebody from the floor can help us with the microphones. And please really take advantage of these extraordinary panelists to ask your questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's been really a magnificent panel. Well, I have a question that's not a formal question, but I will go back to that later. My first question would be related to the last thing that Jorge mentioned, which is the engendering of the fight against corruption, organized crime, and transparency. And it has to do with what all of you have said of the need to visualize the problem from an integral and wider perspective. So OECD, SIDA from Sweden, and different international organizations have considered that engendering the analysis, not only including women, which is a completely different thing, but engendering the analysis and the policies can really change the reality and can really change the outcome of the of the policies. So I don't know, what do you think of ¿Es la alarma? No. Sí, no, no. No, please don't. I come from Mexico City, and I really ran in the earthquake of last September, so really I don't want an alarm. So do you consider from your perspective that in the short term, this could really change the policies in the countries? And I insist, not only including women, but because there's not only need to include women, which that is the fair and the diverse thing to do, but engendering the policies, building data, strong data on this. And the second question, which is not that formal, are the tourist repos linked? What are you? Oh, yeah. 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 Darth Vader, yeah. Yeah. But yeah, that was my question, and I appreciate very much that you included it. You're the okay.
I think we can take a few more questions, and then we can answer them.
I'm Claudia from Bolivia. Thank you very much for this very interesting and high-level panel. I'm a lawyer by background, but not familiar at all with these legal frameworks. I would like to know about the rankings, the corruption rankings, and how our region is ranked in these international rankings. And I also have a comment for Edward about accountability in the public sector. In Bolivia, we implemented a new system in rendering public accounts in public institutions. So every year, the ministries and the municipal governments are rendering the accounts and their plans in public audiences. I don't know yet if these systems are effective, but we would like to know more about experience in other countries. Thank you.
Hello, sorry. I am Andres Gomez. I am not a Chevening alumni, so maybe my question is not going to be as smart as yours. But well, let me try. Maybe it's a question more for Juan Carlos, but it's still an open question. Your case at in DNE is very interesting because it caused a political turmoil that impacted the conservatives, and basically every corruption case in Colombia has a political turmoil. It can affect, for example, in Córdoba, the U Party, in La Guajira, Cambio Radical, etc. And in reality, for the next 4 years, we're going to have to deal with a Congress in which 40-something senators and congressmen are very linked to corruption cases, and we will have to deal with that. In the case of the Santos administration, do you think that Santos had to keep in mind that political turmoil that can cause the fight against corruption in the decisions, for example, fighting against the corruption in the DNE? And the open question will be, till what degree we should always keep into account or keep in mind the political impact on the decisions on fighting against corruption?
I think we will take those 3 questions. And there are 2 questions for the Restrepos, and 3 for, one is also for you, the last one, and the other comment for Eduardo and Laura, of course, if you want to comment on any of the questions by the audience. So Jorge, please.
Very quickly, I do believe that we can make change. And you see, when I mentioned about the effectiveness of policies, I wanted to say that we economists, I'm an economist by training, we tend to overestimate the importance of assessing the effectiveness of policies. And that's why I mentioned this need for political will and for political directive and political discussion. I reckon the only way of, and that's a wonderful word, that I'm sorry that I didn't have it in my language, engendering policies, that is something that need to be done from political will. Let me give you an example. Here We had a very inefficient in Colombia, I mean, judiciary, extremely inefficient. Is expensive, it's far from the citizens. Of course, there has been improvements over the past 2 decades in certain areas. I will say that the area in which there has been less improvement has to do with criminal justice in general. And suddenly in this agreement, the peace agreement, we had this new Justicia Especial para la Paz. And one critical issue was, and this is a happy story, was what was going to be the procedure to name the judges, the magistrates, and the investigators working in the Justicia Especial para la Paz. And since we couldn't get into an agreement of who was going to name these magistrates and who was going to, and how were they going to be chosen, then those that drafted the agreement after the negotiation, they decided that they would give that task basically to the Pope and to other nice people in the world that needed to do that. And they indeed invited Francis Pope and 5 other nice institutions and people to name those judges. Pope Francis didn't accept, and he yielded to, I think it was the European Court of Human Rights. And then these institutions named 5 persons, and then they decided that the key principle in order to name the judges was that it was going to be paritarian. 50% women, 50% men. And suddenly, they were named in October last year, and today, 3 months after, they opened their doors. That for Colombia is, unheard of. It took years to name a judge and to hear a case. They will start working from today. Then I reckon the political will, but bringing women in terms of, what would be the word, equity, or in an equitable proportion to charges for anti-corruption would be critical. Of course, maybe the president wouldn't have named, President Santos wouldn't have named Juan Carlos, but maybe he would have named in equity a woman as good as Juan Carlos as bringing change. But the only way of bringing change would be to bring at least as many women as men to this type of posts and to have political will. But you can do that. CICIG in Latin America is another example of a good story. And I like to mention that I do remember, I don't know if there are Guatemalans here, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the campaign motto of Otto Pérez Molina, the president that is in jail right now for corruption, was mano dura maybe, or mano firme, something like that. And it's very interesting that a Colombian judge who's the head prosecutor of the CICIG, the Comisión Internacional de Lucha contra el Crimen Organizado en Guatemala, is actually, it's Colombian, and it worked much more than mano dura. Mano dura does not work for transnational crime. What works is international cooperation. That's a little bit what I meant to say.
No, just referring to the comment that was mentioned just before regarding the new regulations on Bolivia. As you mentioned, the whole point of this discussion is effectiveness of the regulations and in the implementation. I am unaware if the Bolivian case is effective right now, or if it's going to be effective. But there are many examples that prove that excessive regulations regarding transparency and fight against corruption tend to not necessarily reflect the actual standing on corruption of a specific state. In this sense, I would like to make reference to another case, which is, clearly Guatemala with CICIG and all are examples, but I would like to make reference particularly to El Salvador, where there is a whole presence of legislation against corruption, which has also been endorsed by the Constitutional Chamber of the Judiciary, but that the Defense Ministry, for example, is unwilling to accept. The Defense Ministry, despite specific orders against it regarding transparency, it has still refused to grant determined information about facts that occurred during the armed conflict, which leads us to the whole discussion of the compatibility of, the necessary connection between legislation and the effectiveness. So it is hard to assume that because of the regulations that Bolivia just enacted, it's going to be effective. It's going to need a lot of supervision, a lot of time for us to actually determine, and well, questioning oneself, one would have to ask, what exactly does effectiveness mean when fighting corruption, which is another debate that we can have afterwards and with more time.
Going back to the last question, I would like to say that there's always a political cost in fighting corruption. But it's mainly a political cost with the political class. People will always be thankful when someone fights against corruption. I know that I put President Santos in trouble when I did everything I did. And many times, because he was very keen on maintaining unity, as he called it, because unity was necessary for the peace process. And every time we uncovered something, it directly hit the Conservative Party. And the Conservative Party would go to him and threaten him with releasing the support of all the different laws and processes and all that. But he always kept his word in giving me the support. He managed that crisis over there. And every time since I've known President Santos, that was when he was the Minister of Foreign Trade back in 1992, I have always seen that when he has evidence of corruption, he is absolutely straightforward against corruption. But he's also a politician. He needs to play with politics, never surrendering his principles. That's something I can put my hand in the fire. He gave me his support. There were many times where the unity was in danger because of what I was doing. Many times I asked him if I had become uncomfortable for him. I was willing to return this position to him and ask him to return my life. And he just laughed and he says, go ahead, you have my support. So it is in a country where, like I said, our clientelistic political system favors corruption. Obviously, fighting against corruption can create political problems. But like I said, in front of certain political actors, not in front of society. Society will always, always benefit those people who are clean, transparent, reliable, and those are the people who have the capacity and the ability to represent us.
Thank you very much. Laura, you want to comment on any of the questions? Yeah.
Is there anyone from Transparency International here? Or no? Okay. Because I'm going to make a criticism to what they do. And one of the areas that we really have a serious issue is that we don't know how to measure corruption. That is made about, opinion polls and kind of perception indicators. We can do much better on that. And that's another area in which we will be very grateful if we can get some support for academics.
I would like to add just a small phrase. Fighting against corruption is like fighting against poverty. You will never have the complete task. It's always a matter of of swimming against the tide and being creative and understanding that mechanisms often fall obsolete because the people from corrupt enterprises, they think quicker than we do. So, and they act quicker because they have less restraints.
Okay, so we have 5 more minutes. We have a short comment of Laura, and then we will open again the questions.
I want to say only a comment because it was said that the judiciary, well, of course, in all Latin American countries it's happening this. The judiciary has a bad idea. The people, they don't feel that the judiciary and the prosecutors are doing good things in their jobs, and that is true. No, but I want to point something. Juan Carlos says that the judiciary lack of capacity to represent people. I think that the judiciary, we don't have to represent people, but yes, we need to be seen as we work with legitimacy, that our work is not to represent the people, but yes, for the society to see us as we do things well. And these are different things, because we are not politicians, and we are not voted. Only in some cases the judiciary is voted. I think it's not a good idea, really. But what I do think, and I didn't mention in my presentation, which is another key point for fighting against transnational organized crime, is that the judiciary and the prosecutors, we need independence. And this is a key point. And only with independence, and if we are really independent from the executive powers and from the Congress, we will be seen as doing things good. So I think that is the challenge, which is, it doesn't depend entirely of us. It also is a matter of how you design judges, how you design prosecutors. You have talked also about that. And I think one way we can be near the society, because we need to be near the society, is, for example, with asset recovery and where we put the assets. As I have said, if we have a social benefit of the asset recovery, I think society will see that and will be more responsible and compromise with fighting against organized crime. And that, for example, is what's happening in Italy, where there is a huge campaign for making with the assets, give the assets a social benefit. So I think that's one way in how judiciary and prosecutors can be near society, but not represent society.
Thank you very much. We have time for just 1 or 2 very short questions. If you can go directly to the question, it will be wonderful. No, thank you.
I don't really have a question. I'm going to give a comment and then say, do you agree at the end of it to make it sound like a question. My perspective on corruption, and if you take a historical view, is that you need to look at, for example, the robber baron era in the US, when you had oligarchs like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, who are every bit as much as oligarchs as Carlos Slim and Batista and Mukesh Ambani today. And what broke that robber baron era in the US was, in my view, the New Deal. So the New Deal came in, and I think voters in the US and everywhere have a kind of hierarchy of needs. So before the New Deal came in, their very basic needs weren't being met by the state. And so they needed politicians that would offer them patronage and support in order to get access to very basic things like education and justice. But once that first need was met through the New Deal, and that people had a basic access to public services, they were able to tackle their next instincts, which were to take down the corrupt politicians and elites and bring in the progressive era, which introduced much more robust competition policy and which opened up the democratic process and public participation. And so my theory is that you can talk around this issue a lot, but actually we're talking about public participation, particularly in democratic countries, where if you provide basic public services and educate people to a higher extent, they will themselves then start voting for not those fixers who can give them access to things that in any case are their basic rights, but instead vote for politicians who are more progressive and who are more likely to tackle elites and corrupt practices. Do you agree?
Question, please. Okay.
Well, okay, it's working now. We Latins seem to think that corruption is exclusively of our region, but I just would like to put some historical perspective if I can. 31 years ago, New York City went bankrupt because of massive corruption in the municipal level and the police. And it took them 30 years to join civil society and the media to create a campaign to recover the city. The sticker that you all see, I love New York with that red heart, started at that time. So it goes to show that it takes a long time, it takes planning, it takes commitment. And this brings me to the reality in Brazil today, especially Rio, with the situation happening there. A lot of people fleeing because saying, I don't care, I don't want to be here anymore. And the reason why I'm saying that, because I'd like to commend what Juan Carlos did, having given up an expat position outside of Colombia to come back and help. It's really crucial that we natives and locals stick around and stay behind to make things happen for the better. And for Maria Laura, you did say that in Argentina it takes two to tango and be corrupt. In Brazil it takes a lot more people. It's like samba in carnival. It's a lot of people involved in that. Thank you. Do you agree? Yes, I do agree.
Thank you very much for the comments. I think we have to take it to a close now. Just to have a short recap, we talked about the issue of culture, the issue of action, the issue of cooperation between states and within states, the issue of the relationship between crime, the judiciary, and the political system, of course, the role of academics, and the issue of gender. Please give a round of applause for these wonderful panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Andres and all the panelists for another really interesting session. If you can just stay in your seats for now, so I can just explain the next stage. So we're going to merge the coffee break with our workshop session. So there's coffee and tea outside and some snacks. If I can encourage you all to go and grab a drink and whatever you want to do, and then come back into the room to participate in the workshops. I'm going to hand it over to Camilo, who's going to now describe. We haven't got, well, no, because I think we're not doing great time. Okay. So to explain, so bring your coffee back in.
Okay, hello guys. So this morning the workshop was not about trade, right? So now we are doing both, trade and corruption. So we will split the groups. You will find different questions. So maybe to have a more mixed groups, we can start saying numbers. So we can start over there. So you will be from 1 to 8, okay? So 1. No, you're not. Please. Hello. 5. Can you say the number loud? 5. 8. 1, 2, 3. No, not you. 4. You are 4. Muffin. 6. 7